We're going through a study of faith on the front lines, looking at the question of, I'm just checking my recording. The recording is working. Good. Faith on the front lines, thriving in secular spaces, and it's realizing that we are living in a post-Christian culture. Now, as I mentioned in the sermon this morning, you don't have to be all that old to remember a time where our country was quite a bit different than it is today. We begin looking at so many things that have changed, even in the last 20 years. 20 years ago, every major politician was affirming up one side and down the other that marriage was between a man and a woman. Every one of them. Republican and Democrat on the national stage said marriage is between a man and a woman, and that's it. And then it's like that. Things changed. And all at once, marriage wasn't between a man and a woman anymore. When I was in high school, I studied biology. And when I studied biology, I learned that there were men and there were women. And that was simply a truth. And then all at once, we're going to say that's not true anymore. But even going back further than that, whenever you look at the early 20th century, and I only focus on that because it's documented by way of television and movies, so that we have a pretty good idea of what life was really like back then. And just the realization that whenever you look at the popular television of the early 1960s, I can remember watching Petticoat Junction. And in the course of that rather absurd sitcom, you have the life of the family there being played out. And it showed them going to church. It showed whenever a child was born, they happened to be Presbyterian, and they had the child christened. You would never see that in a major network television show today, because religion has been marginalized, so things have changed. What are the marks of a post-Christian society? Well, the first thing we have to look at is ultimate authority. The Christian worldview puts forward the ultimate authority as God, as revealed through the Bible, and it's objectively accessible to all people. So in other words, from a Christian standpoint, there is such a thing as truth. And you can open the Bible, and I can open the Bible, and it's not your truth or my truth. It's the Word of God. And everyone can be held accountable. The secular worldview, the ultimate authority is human reason, human experience, or empirical evidence, as curated by the elites. So who is it who says what's true and what is not true? Well, as opposed to the Christian standpoint, where there is an objective reality, that means there's one truth for everybody. All at once, there are competing truths. And in fact, they do not even deal with truth so much as they deal with power. Who is in control? And so the elites who curate these truths are the ones who tell you. They're the ones who tell you whether something is the way it is. In other words, you go back some years ago, and marriage was between a man and a woman, and then all at once the Supreme Court says no. In the United States, marriage is now between whatever two people want to say they're married. And so the elite has given the truth down for us. And we find the same thing in terms of education. What is it that children ought to be taught? Well, it used to be that you looked at the basic fundamentals of what it took to be a good member of society. You needed to learn how to read, you needed to learn how to write, and you needed to learn how to do arithmetic. And once you had those in place, you had other civic things that you learned. You learned about history, you learned about the arts, you learned how to be a cultured person. When I was in third grade, we had an entire section where we were trained in how you were to behave when you were a guest at someone's home for supper. And we learned which forks we could use. We learned how to eat different foods, and we were taught that whatever was put in front of you, that you ate it. If you were a guest in someone's home, I still remember the canned prunes. And they were slimy and they had pits in them. But I was trained. I was trained in how to remove the pit politely into the napkin and put it aside. There were things you were taught in order to turn you into a good member of society. So what are we taught today? Well, we're taught a wide range of things. And these things are curated by various elites and are imposed upon us. And woe unto you if you do not agree with the elites. This, by the way, is one of the huge areas of conflict that we are having in our culture. Because many people do not want their children indoctrinated in a certain way. And so they are opting into private education or homeschooling. And this has caused the elites to go into panic. Because what if these young people are actually taught that there is such a thing as a man and such a thing as a woman, and that you can't change that? What if these young people are taught that America really isn't systemically racist and that the race relations in our country are better than in any large nation in the world? What if they're taught these things when it's not what you're supposed to teach them? The elites are very jealous of the corridors of power. We find a post-Christian culture has a different view of the origin of the universe. The Christian worldview is that the universe was created purposefully by God. Now, what is that going to say to us? Well, it tells us a great many things. For one thing, if you really believe in the divine origin and sustenance of the universe, can you get into a panic about human beings destroying the world? Now think about that. There's a stopgap for Christians. If you really believe that God made the world and that God sustains the world, it does not make sense that human beings are going to be able to destroy the world. Whereas the secular worldview is that the universe originated through natural processes like the Big Bang and is devoid of any divine intervention or purpose. Now, one of the underlying paradoxes is if the secular worldview is true, then why should anyone care what happens? If it is just simply a natural process that is occurring and unfolding, then by definition, whatever human beings do is just part of that natural process, and you shouldn't get any more agitated about that than you get agitated over a lion killing a gazelle on the African plains. It just is what happens. One of the great flaws in the secular mindset is holding on to the idea that there's something that ought to be. If you don't believe in an ultimate divine cause, you really have no business saying what ought to be. You can just say what is. And that flows into the question of meaning and purpose. From a Christian worldview, life's meaning and purpose are defined by God and is focused on glorifying God and serving others. The question of serving others. Why is it that you should be good to people? This is one of the great conundrums of the secular world. Going back to the story of the Good Samaritan I referenced in the sermon this morning. From a secular standpoint, why is it better to stop and help the man who's lying on the side of the road rather than passing by on the other side? Why is it better? And you can only say it is better whenever you think in terms that human life is different. The secular worldview sees meaning and purpose as being self-constructed. In other words, I choose what's true, or you choose what's true. We find our own truth. Or as Joseph Campbell was famous for saying, follow your bliss. Whatever makes you happy. Or maybe it's socially constructed. And maybe meaning and purpose is found in personal fulfillment or societal progress. Although once again, those two things are begging a question. What does it mean to be fulfilled? If you can't say what good is, how can you talk about the good life? And unless you know where society ought to be going, how can you talk about progress? And it cuts down to the question of humanity. The Christian worldview is that humans are created in the image of God but are fallen and sinful. Both of these ideas are critical. First of all, that humans are made in the image of God. And that means there are certain things you do not do to human beings. Human beings are not to be treated as commodities. Human beings are not to be treated as animals or machines. But also, human beings are fallen and sinful. And that means nobody is perfect. And that means the elites are not perfect. So there is a need for checks and balances to prevent even the best of people from doing bad things. You know, even the best of people commit sins. And if somebody has absolute power, he or she will ultimately do something that is horrific, even if on the whole they're a good person. And not everybody's a good person. So from a Christian standpoint, there's a realization that human beings are precious, but they are not perfect. From a secular standpoint, the idea is that humans are the product of evolution, And there is really no such thing as sin. Again, back to the lion killing the gazelle, you don't say, well, that's murder, that's sin. No, you say, that's the way the animal kingdom works. And there is really no such thing as good, which leads into the question of morality. The Christian worldview is that morality is absolute. I have within my heart an idea of what is moral, and so do you. We do not live up to that. We all fall short, and we know it. That's why if you are a devout Christian, you have guilt, because you have fallen short and you know you have. But there is an objective reality. And so you and I can have a conversation about what is right and what is wrong, and we can speak in those terms with meaning. If you don't believe in absolute morality, then you're playing a different game. It would be as if you were attempting to play the game of baseball, and I have a rule book for football, and I began talking with you about what ought to happen, and before long we would become very frustrated with one another because we'd be talking past each other. It wouldn't make any sense. From a secular standpoint, morality is seen as relative, cultural, and utilitarian. Now, we look at this, and once again, in some ways, we're begging questions. If you don't have an idea of what is good, how do you know what is useful? Utilitarianism goes back to Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and the idea was that morality and public policy needed to produce the greatest good for the greatest number. But sadly, when you leave God out of the equation, the only good that people can measure is material wealth. There's no way to talk about a greater good in terms of aesthetics or liberty or any other thing that we view as good. All you can talk about is money, the redistribution of wealth. And so utilitarianism is, how do we get the most money into the most people's hands? By the way, this very quickly fed into Marxism, which is a utopia, but a utopia only of the redistribution of wealth, because they have no transcendent value other than economic value. And it leads into the question of the afterlife. Belief in an eternal afterlife, either in heaven or hell, is foundational to the Christian worldview. In contrast, the secular worldview has no belief in an afterlife. It's focused on the current life as the only existence. Now, this carries with it a lot of problems. For example, you don't have to live very long to recognize that the clock is running out. When I was newly graduated from high school, I served as a pallbearer at a young man who graduated from high school with me. The entire time I had known Scott, he had been terminally ill. He had brain cancer. Most people, you talk with them in high school about their goals in life. Oh, which college you're going to go to, his goal in life was always, well, I'd like to make it to the next grade of school. And whenever he finally did graduate, it was so moving. He was in a wheelchair, and we knew it wasn't going to be long. Well, you know, you don't have to live long before more of the people you care about are on the other side than are here. And as you begin dealing with that and you begin asking about your own life and what is the meaning in life, if you don't believe that there's anything beyond this world, it is really sad. In contrast to that, and I'm just going to use a very personal example. Right down this hallway, Ron Brewer is teaching a Bible class on the Gospel of Luke. Now, what is remarkable about that is that Ron has just begun hospice care. He does not think he will make it till the end of the quarter. In fact, he will actually be on borrowed time if he makes it into October. And he knows that, and he is very open with it. And yet, he is taking as much time as he can, preparing his lessons, making the PowerPoints that he has there, and delivering the lesson from a chair. And you look at that and you would say, well, why would you do that? You know, you only have a certain amount of time left. Why don't you just feel sorry for yourself? You know what? He's doing what to him gives life meaning, and that is serving. A belief in the afterlife makes a profound difference in the way you live your life today. The Apostle Paul brings that out so clearly in 1 Corinthians 15. He closes that long discussion of the resurrection with, therefore, brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. Knowing that there is meaning in the world to come. Because I'm telling you, if all you have is this life, you and I are in a heap of trouble. Because this life is coming to an end. The Christian worldview has a difference in its perspective on the role of religion. From a Christian standpoint, religion is central to all aspects of life, including public and private matters. I was very much taken back with the difference between the coronation of King Charles and the coronation of his mother Elizabeth. I was not alive when Elizabeth was coronated, but I've seen the film of it. And in the course of her coronation, she was handed a copy of the Bible and told, this is the greatest treasure of earth. Whereas with Charles, there was a multicultural mismatch of different ideologies put forward. A tremendous change has occurred. In the secular worldview, religion is considered a private matter and separated from public life, including politics and education. From a secular standpoint, if you bring up the idea of religion in the realm of public policy, you are a dangerous extremist. It is not by accident that our Department of Justice are keeping watch on devout Catholics. Did you realize that? That if you are a Catholic, that if you've turned up on a list of Catholics that prefer the traditional Latin Mass, that you are viewed as an extremist that needs to be watched. world do they think they're going to do? That this bunch of nuns are going to start beating people up with their rosaries? My goodness. And yet, that's where we are. The idea that if somebody is devoutly religious, and especially if somebody is bringing their religion into the public square, that person is probably an extremist and needs to be watched. And then the question of science. From a Christian standpoint, science is a limited tool to understand God's creation, but is not in conflict with faith. Something that is captivating to me is to go back and study the intellectual origins of modern science. Because modern science only originated within the framework of Christian culture. Now, other societies made certain scientific discoveries, but they never wove them into a coherent framework of understanding the world. Well, why not? Because they didn't believe that there was one creator of the whole world, thereby you could understand what he had done. But you go back and you study men like Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton, the founders of modern science, and they were men of great faith, and what propelled them in studying the scientific world was a belief in God. It was Francis Bacon who famously said, "You could never be too well educated in the book of God's Word and the book of God's work." By that he meant, study the world around you and study your Bible. The secular worldview puts forward that science is the sole way to attain knowledge and is absolute, often seen in conflict with religious belief. Now, this is one of the great problems of science, which is, if science is absolute, how is it that its bases, its various hypotheses continue to change? Rick Smizzy, before his death, was an elder here. He was a man of science. He had a master's in metallurgy, of all things. He was an engineer. And what he loved to do was go back and buy antique physics books and other science books from the early 20th century, before the days of Einstein. And he would show that what they put forward as absolute truth within a decade wasn't true anymore. You see, back until Einstein, it was settled physics truth that the universe rested upon a great sea of ether, an unseeable, unfeelable substance that we're just bobbing along with. By the way, we still sing in the song, "'Twas midnight and from ether plains." You know what? There are no ether planes. Or you go back in the 1800s, biology held the view of spontaneous generation. What that means is that life just simply appears. And so when you have a piece of meat and you set it out, all at once bacteria is going to appear on that meat. It just spontaneously appears. And it was interesting, the biologist who denied that was a man named Louis Pasteur. He was a devout Catholic. And in the book of Genesis, it says that God created everything, and he said you will reproduce after your kind. And because of that, Pasteur believed in biogenesis. Life comes from life. As a result, he said if you have a closed system, think about a mason jar with a lid on, and you kill off all the life that is in there, think about putting it in your pressure cooker and keeping it at temperature for an hour. There's no longer any bacteria in there, and the meat can't spoil. And you know what? Pasteurization has been a tremendous blessing to mankind. But Pasteur was persecuted, and it took him forever to browbeat. He had to keep crafting various experiments to prove his theory of biogenesis because they didn't want to let go of it. They didn't want to give up what they believed. Science is not absolute. By the way, who were the two greatest biologists of the 1800s? Well, Louis Pasteur was one, the other was Charles Darwin. And I challenge you to find a single benefit that a human being has ever derived from Darwin's theories. In contrast to Pasteur, whom we can thank for the eradication of rabies and so many other things. There's a difference. The secular worldview says that science is absolute, but what if the men in the white coats get it wrong? Oh, well, those white coat men. It's a problem. And then the ethical framework. From a Christian standpoint, ethical decisions are made based on scriptural principles, natural law, and a focus on universal virtues like love and justice. In other words, we can open the Bible and we can look at natural law and we can derive universal principles. And I can say to you, this is right and that is wrong, and you can talk with me and say, I agree with that or I disagree, but we can have a dialogue and there are basic principles we are aspiring to. The secular worldview holds that ethical decisions are often made based on human reason, societal norms, or consequential thinking. In other words, from a secular standpoint, we look at what is ethical, and it really can never get beyond what most people, or at very least what the elite in your society thinks is ethical. For example, what about Christopher Columbus? Was Christopher Columbus a good man or a bad man? Well, as a Christian, we would say he was both. He was both. He was a devout Catholic. He did not live consistent with his Catholic views in certain ways. But was his coming to the New World a good thing or a bad thing? Now, the political correct idea is, it was a horrible thing because we were imposing our values on these innocent natives. Do you realize that just a generation before Columbus arrived, that there had been tens of thousands of human sacrifices offered in order to consecrate the great temple? Montezuma was not an innocent, kindly, primitive. He was a monster. And Western values, a belief in God, a belief in universal human dignity, as inconsistent as it was lived out at the time. But those beliefs were a better thing than the way in which they were living. What about imperialism? Was the British reign in India a good thing or a bad thing? Well, apart from the British being in India, there would not be a democracy in that subcontinent today. And women would find themselves, whenever their husbands died, that they would be thrown upon the funeral pyre, because women were viewed only as having value in connection with their husbands, and when their husbands died, they were put to death, being burned alive. Now, are we in a position to say that that is a good thing or a bad thing? Well, the secular worldview just simply says whatever culture says is true is true. No. We know there is an absolute truth. And while we all fall short of perfection, we have a perfect standard by which we can judge ourselves and others. We find a censoring of traditional values that is occurring. This censoring happens in many different ways. For example, if you post on YouTube a video where you put forward very clearly that a woman cannot become a man and a man cannot become a woman, you will find that that video will either be removed or it will be very restricted in its circulation. Well, why is that? Because the curators of YouTube do not want that message to get out. Before Elon Musk purchased Twitter, it was saying it with Twitter, what is now known as X. Why he chose X, I don't know. It's kind of like what they did with schematics. They told me no one understood what schematics meant, so we had to go with inklings. He said Twitter was too vague, so we're going to go with X. But before he purchased it, there were just simply things you were not permitted to say. There were opinions you were not permitted to have. We find this to be true in academia, where if you hold positions that are contrary to the status quo, you will be censored. There are institutional promotions of anti-Christian perspectives. If you work in the corporate world, you are probably encouraged, if not coerced, into celebrating Pride Month. And if you don't have a rainbow ribbon on your lapel or a pride flag at your desk, viewed as something wrong with you. And heaven help you if you were to publicly proclaim, I believe in traditional marriage. There's an institutional promotion of anti-Christian perspectives. There's an assault on traditional home life. We're finding this especially in states where secularism has gone further, where the state is stepping in, and if families are trying to raise their children with traditional values, those families are running the risk of having the state come in and take the children. In California today, if your child decided that he or she was going to be transgendered, and if you said, that's not what we do in our family, that's wrong, social services very well might come in and take your child to protect them from you. There's an assault on traditional home life. Now, what do we try to accomplish? First of all, we want to find a way of living a Christ-centered life in a changing world. We can't do anything about the world changing. It's going to change. It's kind of like climate. It's going to change. Nobody has any control over that. It just happens. But what do? We need to understand the landscape. Romans 12, verse 2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Two parts of this. First of all, do not be conformed to this world. That means you have to understand what the world is telling you. By testing, you may discern. And we need to have our minds renewed in faith. 1 Corinthians 16:13. Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. We go back and look at the great men and women of faith in the first century. And they lived in a pre-Christian society. And they were persecuted because of their convictions. And yet they stood firm. And ultimately they overcame the pre-Christian culture in which they lived. We need to be prepared to address controversial issues. And this is something that we need to bring into the church more fully. There must not ever be any topic that is off limits for discussion within the family of God. We must never say, well, we're going to agree to disagree. So if you believe that a man can become a woman and I don't believe that, let's just not talk about that. Or if I believe that marriage is only between a man and a woman and it is to be for life, and you believe something else, let's not talk about that. There should be nothing off the table. Because it's not a matter of your opinion or my opinion. It's a question of the truth of God. But we need to learn how to do this with kindness. Ephesians 4:13, rather speaking the truth in love. We have to speak the truth and we have to do it in love. And we need to build meaningful relationships. We need to dialogue without being contentious. Colossians 4, verse 6, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. And to have community and fellowship. And we need to embrace love. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Now, in the course of our study, we'll be looking at various contexts. We'll be looking at how we function in the workplace. We'll be looking at how we function in our homes. But in all of this, we're going to return to the truth that Jesus Christ has called each one of us to be his disciple. And that means making the right decision in our context, wherever we may find ourselves. And we need to be in a position to share that truth with others. Because in doing that, we can authentically be Christian. And we can be able to hold back the onslaught of a secular society that is a very dangerous place. But the good news is, the one who is with us is greater than the one who is in the world. We'll be picking up there next week. Thank you very much.